It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Dylan Mulvin. Dr. Mulvin joins us from the London School of Economics, where he's an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communication. And he also heads up a program, a Master's of Science program in Media and Communications. Dr. Mulvin is a historian of media, technology, and culture, and he investigates each through a dynamic approach influenced by cultural studies, media studies, disability studies, and gender studies. His work addresses the materiality of media artifacts and how they intersect with emotions, the senses, and perceptions. Dr. Mulvin has authored and co-authored a number of articles which explore everyday technologies that seem banal on their face, but as he aptly illustrates, they are often accompanied by rather unexpected histories and contingencies. He's written about the politics of harm prevention with night modes, or that kind of orange screen you get when you're trying to fall asleep at night. He's also written about Y2K and the public education campaign around that. And finally, with the late, great Jonathan Stern, a history of the managerial authority of the instant replay. Dr. Mulvin's work is eminently inviting, while situated in a rich historical and theoretical tapestry. Dr. Mulvin's 2021 MIT Press book, Proxies, The Cultural Work of Standing In, explores the cultural significance of the prototypes and standards we assume as representative of a variety of phenomenon, and of course these things come to stand in as representations for those things as well. As Mulvin states, proxies function as a necessary forms of make-believe and surrogacy that enable the production of knowledge. Examples from the book include crash test dummies and the Lena standard test image, which is a pixelated color test used in computing that originated from a 1972 Playboy centerfold image. Another is an exploration of a mock city built for the purposes of carrying out military exercises in conflict zones. Mulvin thinks about what it means that these are particular proxies against which we measure, and the assumptions about race, gender, and disability and able bodies that we implicitly bake into them. As he says, these proxies capture the world in an instant, but what do they take for granted in the process? Tonight, Dr. Mulvin is going to discuss research coming out of his monograph, which he's currently working on, writing on the history of anger, art, and media, titled Technologies of Rage. This work extends Dr. Mulvin's ongoing interest in the cultural mediation of emotion and explores the ways in which rage and how we make sense of it are situated within political and economic crisis. If recent headlines are any indication, Dr. Mulvin's work is highly relevant in our cultural moment. The title of Dr. Mulvin's talk is The Moment of the Rage Room, Media, Purgation, and Politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dylan Mulvin.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm just gonna empty my pockets. I'm a pacer, so I'm gonna try to stay a little bit still. Thank you all. Thank you for those introductions. It was really meaningful. I want to thank Ben Wu and Liam for inviting me and getting me here. It's a pleasure to be back. I want to thank Miranda for the great introduction. I'm very happy to be here giving the Paul Attallah lecture. I did not know Paul Attallah. I do remember reading his work first as an undergrad at SFU, and I was charmed to learn that we were both doctoral students at McGill in communication studies, though some years apart. And in preparing for tonight, I had no idea, where is Liam? Oh, I had no idea what you were gonna say. I read that piece too. It was great. But I also delved back into his McGill thesis, and he wrote beautifully and evocatively about media systems. And many of the things he had to say about television and networks and audiences were prescient and incisive, and I was really struck by his writing on memory. So it's an honor to be giving this lecture. Thank you. But you were half expecting like a magic trick when I came back up, right? This project begins in the rage room and looks backwards. And I should say it's about 55 minutes long if you're planning any breaks or anything, and that should hopefully give us enough time for questions. If I don't answer your question later, I would love if you want to email it to me or to contact me in any other way, if you want more time to think about a question. We start in the rage room and we look backwards. The rage room is a contemporary phenomenon, a product of our time. And rage rooms offer a service. For a one-time fee of $20 to $50 or pounds or euros, rage rooms offer their customers a closed space, a menu of breakable objects, and a weapon. Within a fixed time limit of around 15 to 30 minutes usually, these customers or ragers can smash objects at will. Most rage rooms are stocked with household and common office objects, things like cups and glasses, plates and keyboards and monitors, sometimes a washing machine or another appliance. I've smashed a dishwasher and an old CD player. The surplus from thrift stores, right, waste from donations of broken and obsolete technology. And while images of prepared rage rooms kind of look like weird ready-made sculptures. I was at the National Gallery today. It has a kind of Duchampian, reinterpretation, right? Used rage rooms are often rimmed with jagged metal, broken plastic, and shards of glass. Today, you can find rage rooms in cities around the world. They are not always permanent fixtures. They often take up unused commercial space, right? Unused areas. They exist along other artifacts of the experience economy, like axe throwing or flame throwing or escape rooms. They're often called things like clubs or labs or spaces, right? Kind of nomenclature of the present. But wherever they are, rage rooms universally traffic in a common sense idea that venting one's rage is cathartic. That is, rage rooms rely on the idea that we need to vent pent-up anger and that it is justifiable, necessary, and healthy to express rage and to cleanse ourselves of anger in that process. The rage room, though, commodifies this idea by creating an interiorized and controlled outburst. Here in Ottawa, you have at least 2 rage rooms, as well as a mobile vengeance van. I'll come to it in a minute. Typical for the genre, the Smash Room advertises itself as a great place to come to relieve your daily stresses and anxiety, all the while leaving the mess for us to clean. I know it's not that readable, that's the key quote. Therefore, combining the promise of stress relief through violence with no consequences, which is typical of the rage room. The Rec Room, here in Ottawa, advertises itself as a place to get your head right and describes itself as, quote, a modern mental health care facility. And not sarcastically. The website ties its origins to its founder's experience as a mother and a carer, and draws a line from personal struggle to the need to purge emotion through controlled violence, and eventually to providing that as a service to others. It traffics in something called, it's one of many, many places that advertises its service as destructo therapy. And this is another rage room in Memphis that advertises destructo therapy. And as you can see, the booking form promises to help you master your, what does it actually say? I can't see it on my screen. It says, I would like to master my anger, right, when you book. Back to Ottawa. There's your vengeance van. The mobile vengeance van is like, I mean, it's a very bizarre remnant of the truck convoy turned inwards, right? Where that exteriorized violence of the convoy is kind of folded back in black hole style, or what I think black holes look like from TV, and it invites its participants inside the closed chamber of the cargo container at their own convenience, right? It's all about being able to come to your home. So, quote, you want to wreck stuff, you say? But no sitter for the kids? Good news. You can now bring the monitor into the truck to watch the kids while using the new mobile service. It's interesting, a lot of rage rooms, both in their own advertising and when sort of news coverage talks to them, talk about the gendering of the space, and they say, oh, actually a majority of our users are women, and there's a lot tied in here to sort of feminized labor, parenting, and anger, like a pent-up anger around gender, and in particular, parenting. But what all three of these local examples show is the kind of contemporary rage room as a promise of contained, on-demand, and consequence-free catharsis for a fee, right? We'll clean up the mess. And this is the essence of the rage room. And what makes it, for me, such a compelling contemporary phenomenon, and its many contradictions. The history of the rage room is usually traced to 2008 and to Tokyo, to something called the Venting Place, which was a mobile van that pulled up in the financial district during that financial crisis, and opened up the back and allowed people to hurl crockery at a wall, to, quote, allow stressed workers to pay to hurl crockery against a concrete wall in a bid to ease recession-related angst. The owner, the founder of the Venting Place, went on to say, to break something, as all of us know from experience, is something extremely exhilarating, and it helps us bring down pent-up anger. Right? That same common sense idea we'll come back to over and over again is there at its origins. And in the same year, separate from the Venting Place, the Swiss-Danish artists Katja Kublitz and Ronnie Yarosel had created their own version of a crockery-smashing catharsis machine called the Anger Release Machine, which is, as you can see, a vending machine that allows you to pay. It's full of plates and glasses and statuettes, so after you buy the object, it falls into the bottom and smashes. I don't think you're really meant to reach in, but I'm not entirely certain. As in the case of the Venting Place, the Anger Release Machine promises to cleanse pent-up rage and to provide immediate and gratifying release, right? Truly like a vending machine. The Venting Place, the Anger Release Machine, both of these, I think, speak to kind of mundanity of anger and rage and catharsis. It's accordant with a broader cultural view of angry office workers in particular and angry parents, right? And people on edge, always on edge. You can think sort of representations of like Michael Douglas in Falling Down, right? Or many rage rooms offer a premium service that will allow you to pay to smash a printer, which is a clearly mimetic reference to the 1999 cult comedy Office Space, where three men working the cubicle life vent their despair and frustration by mutilating a troublesome printer set to the Ghetto Boys song Still, right? Stomping the printer, bashing it with a baseball bat, and then leaving its remnants in a field. It's very easy to find local news coverage, YouTube coverage, human interest pieces, influencer videos from cities around the world, where the rage room is presented as a kind of curiosity. These stories often follow a recognizable pattern. They show the rage room like this, usually full of destroyed electronics. They profile the owner, and they talk about the therapeutic importance of venting rage. The owners or customers will repeat common sense views that rage needs an outlet. They will say, if it wasn't in here, then it would be outside. There's a pervasive notion in these videos that the rage room is a safe outlet for anger. In one of these videos, many YouTube videos collected, a woman is talking about her partner and his rage and his unspent anger. And the video cuts to him smashing things, and there's a kind of violence that haunts the text. This ambivalence further twists the purpose of the rage room and the many claims that are made about its social role. Though Japan's venting place may have attached its existence to a spike in economic stress, the potential uses of rage rooms are often explicitly plastic, right? So in a typical bit of marketing, one outlet in Birmingham in the UK describes itself as the perfect place to de-stress, team build, or have an unforgettable date. And this plasticity, I think, speaks to an unsettled status of rage within the rage room and what we might see as a kind of paradox. Because rage is meant to be explosive, unpredictable, and hydraulic. We speak of rage in terms of episodes, of spasms, of outbursts. The rage room, by contrast, is highly controlled. You have to often book weeks or months ahead of time, right, to a precise 15 or 30-minute period. It's a timed outlet for venting anger. It could be the perfect date night, or a preventative measure to release uncontrolled anger, or the ideal place for your corporate team bonding exercise, or a spout for economic anxiety, and on and on. The pervasive offering of rage rooms as a necessary response to pent-up anger is typical of the ways, I think, and I will talk about for a while longer, anger and rage are discussed in this period, in this moment. This is a discourse fully baked into much of our cultural theory, our philosophy, our art, and our public discourse. Writing about the internalized trauma of colonial violence, in Black Skin, White Masks, for instance, Frantz Fanon writes of what he calls collective catharsis, and declaring, in every society, in every collectivity, must exist, a channel, an outlet, through which the forces accumulated in the form of aggression can be released. And it's this idea that I'm really trying to get to here, right? The channeling, the processing, the mediation of rage. Here, it is media that are being invoked by Fanon in the sense that rage must take a channeled form, a means of realization, a materialization of affect. Which leads us back to the moment of the rage room and two senses of moment that I'm playing with here. One sense of moment being the actual moment of release or cleansing or purging emotion. And the second sense being a cultural moment in which forces come together, economic, affective, and ideological, to characterize a particular period. And one that I'm arguing is woven through with senses of rage. So we can turn in this moment to these rooms to understand how the world is being made and unmade all at once. I'm calling this the media of purgation. And the project I'm talking about today, which as mentioned is the basis of a new book on rage and catharsis and technology and art, is based on archival research, discourse analysis, participant observation, some autoethnography. And what I'm talking about is framed around a process of losing control to gain control. By which I mean, in the media of purgation, both the actual channels through which rage is processed and expressed, but also the mediated representation of anger. Thus, this research is driven by the contradictions that I think are provoked by the rage room, right, and its embeddedness within a larger cultural milieu. And I'm asking today, why the rage room? Why now? What happens when we room rage? What are the implications of this kind of commodification, the housing of rage, and its containment in a room? This project takes up but does not immediately accept the catharsis argument, the common sense view that it's necessary and healthy. I want to hold it at arm's length. I'm not completely skeptical either. I just want to look at it. I just want to have a look. And to understand the kinds of claims that are being made on behalf of the rage room and behalf of the angry. So a focus on purgation, I think, orients our attention towards the desire to cleanse and to rid ourselves of feeling. And I want to ask what it is exactly that we're cleansing. I'm trying, in other words, to understand this relationship between concepts of anger and destruction and catharsis and how they're mediated in public life, especially in the ways that rage is understood as simultaneously dangerous, right? The most dangerous kind of affect, and personally and politically transformative. So in a political and cultural context in which rage is a salient affect, and one that we'll talk about plenty, that cuts all the way across the political spectrum, all the way across every possible identity category, right? How does this interiorization, how does the containment of rage reshape that transformative potential of destructive anger? So, I believe to understand this political moment, to understand the work of rage in our specific context, at this political, cultural, and affective conjuncture, what I'm calling the moment of the rage room, to understand this political moment, we must understand the work of rage in articulating cultural politics, material surroundings, and personal and social transformation. We have to talk about the ways that rage is understood, mobilized as both a political, social, and personal affect. So if you have been to San Francisco or the Bay Area recently, I have a show of hands if anyone's been to, yeah, right. So you will have noticed, right, that there are Waymo cars everywhere. These are fully autonomous vehicles, right? They kind of pockmark the streets. The cars themselves are covered in dozens of cameras. If you're driving or you're a pedestrian, they're really off-putting. They accelerate really aggressively, and they decelerate really aggressively. If you see them out of the corner of your eye, they look like an aggressive driver. It makes for a kind of ghostly and uncanny experience as both a pedestrian and a driver. It also concretizes the evacuation in the Bay Area of social support, dependable and livable work, and the fracturing of community in the region during this, like the last few decades in which capital has completely captured the region. Hence, some people in February of 2024 took it upon themselves to seemingly and spontaneously destroy a Waymo car. And all sorts of explanations were given for this destruction. But when the anti-ICE protests erupted in Los Angeles this past June, 3 months ago, protesters once again targeted Waymo cars, lighting them on fire and using the husks as barricades and blocking US Freeway 101. 5 Waymo cars were destroyed in this way, forcing the company to remove all Waymo cars from the center of Los Angeles. Not to be outdone, many rage rooms provide a service where you can pay extra to smash a car. This is from London's Smash Lab that, quote, invites all road ragers to come and smash a car in an exclusive collaboration with Brixton's Street Gym. I didn't go. Back in Ottawa, here's the same service offered by the Rec Room. Note that the promotion of this event, which you can't quite make out, but I can tell you, is advertised as family-friendly, as appropriate for anyone as young as 2. At that point, I don't know why under 2 would be a problem. Just let them have it. I also really appreciate, I want to dwell for a second on the caveat of the Rec Room's car service, that car smashing is a privilege. That's the highlighted 4 asterisks there. Smashing a car is obviously a long-standing act of protest, right? Though destroying a driverless automated vehicle is something specific to the present, right? It could only happen right now. And this horizontal connection I want to draw here is the way that the moment of protest directed against carceral state violence has a parallel mirror world in which rage rooms provide a space of controlled and consequence-free violence. providing proxy targets like printers or cars, couched often in the language of affective frustration at contemporary life, but not political frustration, right? Everyday life frustration, which is obviously political, but it is not directed at the carceral system. It's directed at burnout, right? Economic angst. And there's this ambivalence here, an uncertainty about whether such proxy experiences quell, contain, diffuse, dissipate, magnify anger that is ignited by felt injustice. I'm going to go broader now, beyond the rage room, to a much wider world of anger objects. So while I begin and center the rage room, I started to walk. While I begin and center the rage room, it is also, I think, just a node, but a really important node, a big node, in a much wider network of media artifacts, movements, and cultural scripts, just as the anger release machine appears at the same time as the venting space. So, for instance, we're going to go through a lot of them. There was, in 2020, during lockdown, an app called the Scream Club that allowed you to upload your own scream and tap into the screams of others. I will be playing it in a minute, so get ready. It was great. It was a really interesting object, right? It spoke to the frustration of being in lockdown, of being pent up. It used technology to kind of create a new kind of social media network that was just screams, right? It was fantastic. There's a similar art project, a more kind of artistically oriented one called the Collective Scream, very similar idea. There was a deadline to send in your scream. There's plenty of news coverage as well about feminist scream clubs. They're kind of popping up around the world. It's a very similar idea, but without the material destruction, right? Screaming, but without smashing things. Sorry. A group in Chicago has subsequently trademarked the term Scream Club, which is not an app, but is a franchise that you could very well buy into and set one up in Ottawa that is a kind of self-help screaming center, offering kind of franchise licenses to anyone who wants to open a local chapter. And there's the kind of appified control of anger and its representation. So this is me getting an ad for the app Ahead, being marketed as Duolingo, but for anger. And on the right-hand side there is me taking the introductory survey, which is kind of sensitizing. It's essentially an app version of CBT, but it's being kind of framed around the legibility and purchase of anger in this period. It's likely, I mean, my university now is using virtually exactly this app in the place of actual mental health support for students. I could imagine similar things are happening in Canada. And what I'm trying to do here is to build up this moment, right, through the material culture of anger and rage. But I want to be clear that this material culture is built on and builds out the widespread impression that we are in an era typified by anger and rage. Hence, there's a booming literature for gendered, raced, intersectional anger and rage from the past decade or longer, but really, not surprisingly, starts to build around 2016. And ever since then, there's been about a decade of a very, very popular literature offering an account of the repression and release of anger and its liberatory potential, or just the potential of recognizing it and naming it. So things like Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper, Rage Becomes Her, Good and Mad, books like Mum Rage, and Women Are Angry, and Old Rage, right? All of which speak to kind of gendered anger. There's an academic literature that corresponds with this, so things like a recent issue of Feminist Media Studies that focused on the gendered politics of mediated rage, and a special issue of Signs that was devoted to the exact same subject. As the editors at Signs note, however, the politics of rage are far from guaranteed, and they argue that it is both an instrument of patriarchy as well as a potential feminist resource. Again, speaking to the kind of plasticity that's imagined for rage. I'm just like, what is it? What kind of energy is it? In the final chapter of Sarah Benet Weiser's Empowered, the final chapter is simply called Rage, in which she turns to popular misogyny after spending the rest of the book talking about popular feminism. And she talks about popular misogyny as generated by the popularization of feminist movements and demands, right, as a reactionary anger. To wit, there's a complementary bibliography trying to offer insight and explanations about far-right anger, white male anger. So something like Carol Anderson's, it's a great book, 2016, White Rage, offers a history of African-American experience told from the end of the Civil War, right, as told as a story of white American hatred and resentment as a response to emancipation. But you have books like Bob Woodward wrote 4 volumes about the first Trump administration, the final one of which is just called Rage. When the New York Times released its massive interactive thing about the January 6th coup, they just called it 90 Seconds of Rage, right? This is also an image of recent racialized, racist anger in London. All of which, right, speak to the kind of contemporary purchase of this idea that we are living in a time of anger and rage as the emotion that characterizes and typifies this period. And the 2024 election, of course, reignited this feeling, and it's lingered, right? It's all we're talking about. I don't have to convince you, but I'm still going to keep talking about it. Richard Seymour, this is a new book that he's just published with Verso, has called the rise of far-right movements across the globe an effect of disaster nationalism. He characterizes it as growing out of a moment of insurgent energy, an insurgent anger, motivated by a psychosocial desire, as he describes it, for violent restoration. These are 2 images from the day after the last US election. So one was the Financial Times lead editorial that said, anger is the defining energy of Western politics, and that quelling rage is a democratic imperative across the world, right? This is a complementary argument that says, if you want to save democracy, you need to extinguish rage, which is different from venting it. Right? And on the right-hand side is a queer arts center and music club in New York, which the day after offered a cathartic scream club, which would allow people every night to come to the club to just scream. And the proceeds were earmarked for Planned Parenthood, in essence using collective catharsis as a fundraising tool for abortion access. In this project, I'm using Barbara Rosenwein's concept of emotional communities. And it's a term developed to describe groups in which people adhere to the same norms of emotional expression and value, or devalue the same or related emotions. That's her definition. It's the one I'm using as well. Crucially, such groups share fundamental assumptions, values, goals, feeling rules, and accepted modes of expression. This is not a universalist account of emotions. This is not advocating for sort of fundamental emotions, as some do, but rather for kind of communal and communally maintained and held emotional valuation. I should say that more than one emotional community can and does coexist, right? And that's what we're going to talk about for the next half of this. And that these communities are, in true cultural studies fashion, contingent and subject to change and responsive to the dynamics of discursive domination and subversion. So there's no end of reasons to be angry, right? The bibliography I went through says that everyone is angry or ought to be angry. But I want to be really careful here because when I think that, while that rage is a prevailing emotion, I don't want to flatten all anger and say it's all the same, even if everyone is angry. They're not angry for the same reasons, and that anger is different, right? It can be different. But I'm also kind of confounded by that problem. So there's a question of type, right? Different types of anger. the reasons for being angry are widely divergent and often closely related, one resulting from the other. So there's a significant discrepancy as well in whose anger is actually recognized and legitimated, right? Who's allowed to be angry, whose anger is paid attention to, whose anger is responded to. And second is the question of the use of anger. So along with this discrepancies around motive and legitimacy is kind of rage practices, where some people believe the expression of anger and rage is useful or acceptable or healthy, and others reject it as a legitimate response to felt injustice. As Amya Srinivasan argues in The Aptness of Anger, this kind of political and transformative potential of anger, right, that people have spoken up and claimed anger, and the possibilities of kind of collective just rage, results from a recalculation and a reassertion of the aptness of anger as a response to injustice, especially when righteous anger has been systematically denied to so many people for so long. And you can place Srinivasan's argument alongside Sarah Ahmed's similar argument about rage and the cultural politics of emotion and elsewhere, where they both make the case for a willful subject that translates or transforms their anger into a project for justice, while others argue that anger of this kind is always regressive. The most vocal academic to represent this viewpoint is Martha Nussbaum, the moral philosopher. In her book, Anger and Forgiveness, she argues that all anger, even just anger, in the face of absolute wrongdoing, is implicated in a regressive desire for revenge, and that the only justifiable alternative is meekness, forgiveness, and generosity that leads to repair. She says, at the heart of my argument is an analysis of anger, concurring with a long philosophical tradition that includes Aristotle, the Greek and Roman Stoics, Bishop Butler. I argue that anger includes, conceptually, not only the idea of a serious wrong done to someone or something of significance, but also the idea that it would be a good thing if the wrongdoer suffered some bad consequences somehow. I argue that anger so understood is always normatively problematic. Nussbaum recognizes that the desire to lose control to gain control is pervasive, but believes that the right response to anger is reason, love, and grace. She writes, anger, or the road to revenge, is normatively problematic because the beliefs involved are false and incoherent, ubiquitous though they are. They derive from deep-rooted but misleading ideas of cosmic balance and from people's attempt to recover control in situations of helplessness. Srinivasan responds. And for Nussbaum and people who follow this viewpoint, the Stoics, Bishop Butler, and I think for us more legibly, right, contemporary commentators who say anger is counterproductive. It's the wrong response, right? If you want to get what you want, you need to be reasonable. Right, that's the same voice. Rage is counterproductive. Anger is counterproductive because it's irrational and draws away from reason and compromise. That's the reasons given for the counterproductivity critique. When Srinivasan responds by saying that the proponents of the counterproductivity critique run the risk of a second harm. Is this wrong that has something in common with the most straightforwardly oppressive ways of speaking about anger? She says, the misogynist dismisses a woman's anger by calling her shrill or strident. The racist dismisses the black person's anger by calling him a thug or animal. And these are not mere insults. These are rhetorical strategies that shift the explanatory context for the subject's anger from the space of reasons to the space of causes, essentially saying it's not because of what you've experienced, but because of who you are. And this produces what she calls a second injustice that compounds and magnifies the original harm, what she calls an affective injustice, the inability to voice your emotion and be heard in voicing it. So while some moral philosophers and many public commentators, and we can say it is, just a normative viewpoint too, that public anger is counterproductive, and they dispute the productivity of anger in public life, mainstream psychological research has also sought to disprove the efficacy of catharsis. I'm not an illustrator, but I've tried my hand at recreating Brad Bushman's experimental psychology test room at Iowa State University in 2002. This is the most widely cited study that attempts to disprove the efficacy of catharsis. I'll describe briefly how this experiment ran and what it found. So there were 602 college students enrolled in an introductory psychology class who received extra credit for participating. It was 300 men, this is all reported by Bushman, 300 men and 302 women, because 2 women were excluded for refusing to punch the punching bag. And they were tested individually. So each person was brought into this room, and they were told that they were studying first impressions. And so they would be writing an essay, exchanging it with a partner who was in an unseen room, and then comparing first impressions. They were told to write an essay about abortion, whether they were for or against it, and that their partner would be swapping essays with them and giving them feedback. Regardless of what they wrote, they received their feedback back, covered in red writing, that's the essay on the table there, marking up grammatical and spelling errors that didn't even necessarily exist, and writing on the bottom, "This is the worst essay I've ever read." And they were suitably incensed. And then there were 3 treatment groups. One group was told to punch the punching bag and to look at the computer monitor, which just happened to have the ID photo of their partner in the other room, which are actually photos taken from a soccer magazine in the 1990s, which that photo also is, because I'm good at doing my research. The second group was told to punch the punching bag and think about getting fitter, also looking at soccer players. And the third group were told, we're having a problem with the computer, can you just sit there, we'll get it fixed. And nothing was done. And of course, they never met their partner didn't exist. But before and after the experiment, they filled out psychometric surveys, and they were being monitored behind two-way glass at the same time, while research assistants measured the enthusiasm, rate, and intensity of their punching. Bushman's findings showed that the group that looked at the photo and ruminated on their unseen partner left the room the angriest. The room that thought about getting fitter left the room a little bit angry. And the group that just sat there while they tried to fix the not broken computer left the room the least angry. Bushman's continued this work up into the present, and last year published a meta-analysis of similar work, arguing that the only thing that reduces anger is relaxing activity like yoga, and that venting anger always magnifies and extends it in the short term and the long term. He says, in a really incredible sentence, that people were best off doing nothing at all than venting their anger. And these results provide one more nail in the coffin containing catharsis theory. So where does this leave us? What I may be looking at is, in fact, the formation of 2 competing emotional communities with opposing views on the potential for anger as a personally transformative force, and if you want to scale up from it, a socially transforming force. It's a conflict that is not resolvable, right? These are not commensurable viewpoints. A fact I want to return to as we continue to the final part of this lecture. And there's another dimension to this public life and personal life of anger that I want to look at. And that's the connection between rage, catharsis, and technology. In his recent-ish book, The Age of Anger, Pankaj Mishra writes that, and this is about the kind of, as we know, this is a communication and journalism school, right? Networks of communication, we are understood that we understand that they are meant to cultivate and express anger, right? And they're They're the problem. They're part of the problem of this moment of anger. They're exacerbating resentment and hatred. Pankaj Mishra writes that individuals of the internet, individuals with very different pasts, find themselves herded by capitalism and technology into a common present, where grossly unequal distributions of wealth and power have created humiliating new hierarchies. This proximity, or what Hannah Arendt calls negative solidarity, is rendered more claustrophobic by digital communications, the improved capacity for envious and resentful comparison, and the commonplace and therefore compromised quest for individual distinction and singularity. So even though his book is called The Age of Anger, the book is largely about the 18th century and different protest manifestations of anger in that period. But it's noteworthy, I think, when he thinks about the present, that he chooses these images of claustrophobia, of herding, of crowding, to explain the generation and ferment of anger. We're going to watch a short video for just a minute. This is a recent ad for the British telecom company BT that they released in 2021 called Why Suffer Broadband Rage?
Wi-Fi's down.
Keep talking.
Reconnect the router at the mains. Reconnect the router at the mains. Reconnect the router at the mains.
What's that sound? Oh, that's that. Can we turn that off? Thanks. So when I refer to the moment of the rage room, I am referring to the abundant, intricate, and messy connections of rage in this moment, in which Black rage and feminist rage and trans rage and poor rage and disabled rage are variously lauded and variously delegitimized, criminalized, and cast as overzealous responses to marginalization. And yet, what I think makes this the moment of the rage room is that the criminalization of just anger and the uplift of angry white men can coexist alongside and in many ways provide the discursive grounding for a broadband provider's advertising campaign, right? It looks like a rage room. It makes sense. And this is what I really want to get at, right? The squeeze of this room, the domestic box, the container, the way that the ad portrays aggravation and intensity of this claustrophobic space as, in a sense, cultivating and generating anger. Here, tapping into the frustration of infrastructural glitch during a period of really precarious and heightened feeling about the contingencies of at-home working. It's an example of what Neta Alexander calls, in her brilliant new book, interface frictions. Here, manifesting as poor bandwidth, leading to the monstrous reconfiguration of a body, right, in response to the router. This is Canadian artist Jeff Wall's Destroyed Room, his first major artwork. It's artwork number 1 in his catalog. It's owned by the National Gallery. It's not currently on display. Don't ask. And it was first shown at the Nova Gallery in Kitsilano in 1978. It's an artistic precursor, I would say, to the Rage Room. It's a lightbox photograph. It's his first lightbox photograph. It's usually noted for its composition, which art historians like to point out reflects the death of Sardanapalus, an 1827 tableau by Eugène Delacroix, showing a funeral pyre covered in bodies and treasure. It's noted for the way it weds classical composition with the format of contemporary commercial advertising. Other people like Leah Modigliani have written about the underexplored aspect of Wall's work, the the gendered representation as an underexplored aspect of Wall's work, and how this space, along with other photographs in Wall's oeuvre, often employ the signifiers of kind of domestic, feminized life. I'm drawn to this photograph for the wall supports that you can see outside the door and window, and the braces that are visible through that doorway. The nearby brick wall on the other side of the room. These elements, in his first public photograph, are the signifiers of what would become his signature style, what he himself calls blatant artifice. It's the braces that make clear that this is not a room in a house, but a set, a space contrived to contain this scene. It captures, in other words, the queasy, contradictory nature of contemporary rage rooms, the way they offer blatantly artificial means of channeling and containing rage. For me, this is a special cultural conjuncture, right, in which rage has specific purchase. I'm a media historian, as Miranda mentioned. Most of this project is also looking backwards. And for me, that looking backwards ends up in the 1960s, though other genealogies are available, and with some stops on the way. One of those stops is in the work of Susan Stryker and Audre Lorde, and Stryker's work on performing transgender rage in the inaugural volume of GLQ, and Audre Lorde's work in the uses of anger and her poetry. In performing transgender rage, which was originally delivered as a performance piece for a conference titled Rage Across the Disciplines at California State San Marcos, she was speaking as an organizer before her academic life, as an organizer of the activist group Transgender Nation. And at the time, as she says, the group was, quote, involved in organizing a disruption and protests at the American Psychiatric Association's 1993 annual meeting in San Francisco. And this is important for reasons we'll come to. As Stryker writes, in remembrance of this event, a good deal of the discussion at our planning meetings concerned how to harness the intense emotions emanating from trans experience, especially rage, and mobilize them into effective political actions. Harness and mobilize. In the uses of anger and a poem for women in rage, right? Anger features widely in Lorde's work. It's a theme. The first was published as an essay and speech delivered to the National Women's Studies Association Conference in 1981, right? And the poem was published in the same year. Both texts speak to embodied anger, experience of violence, racism, and what we might now call the clarifying power of rage, where Lorde draws on insurgent energy and an embrace of anger and a rejection of silencing, right? And regret at having been angry, or having been silent, rather. I think that these texts and performances and these calls to action from the 1980s and 90s are resonant precedents for our moment. And they stand as key texts of the last 40 years. Though my main comparative decade, another moment of rooming rage, is the 1960s. And looking back at things like Black Rage by William Greer and Price Cobbs, and Arthur Janoff's Scream Therapy. Both of these are works that tried to deal with suppressed and internalized trauma as an explanation of personal and social strife. And they think of rage as a productive and often stigmatized and criminalized response to trauma. I'm also looking at the Destruction in Art Symposium, which takes place in September 1966 in London at the Africa Center. This is a major art event. It was a 3-day event, but there were things that kind of going on all month. It's one of the first times Yoko Ono performs Cut Piece, the artwork where she sits on stage and allows people to cut off her clothing. The archive of Dias, which I've consulted to help shape this project, is full of the materialization and expression of destructive anger. It includes things like explosive art and animal sacrifice that led to the artist being arrested by the Metropolitan Police, and just widespread destruction, the destruction of a piano, as you can see there. It was also held at Africa Center in Covent Garden, which had only opened 2 years before, to be a kind of coordination space for newly independent African nations, and later became the key organizing site for anti-apartheid struggle. This invitation to Dias here invites, quote, writers, psychologists, sociologists, and others interested in the relation between aggression in society and destruction in art. But the organizer, Gustav Metzger, was working on this stuff long before the symposium. This is drafts of his manifesto on autodestructive art. Right? And one thing I'm really interested here is how these artists were tying a connection between artistic expression and exploration and the use of anger within the Africa Center as an exploratory medium and responding to what they felt like was violence beyond the artistic space. I would be remiss if I did not mention the Days of Rage, which finished the 1960s as the Weather Underground splinters off from Students for a Democratic Society and stages a week of protests, and then eventually becomes a domestic terrorist organization, right? And consulting the Weather Underground archive at UMass Amherst, it's full of all sorts of internal history, right? Where they're trying to account for what happened to the group, what drove it apart. And this is an amazing passage on the relationship between spontaneity and consciousness. And they talk about how you plan direct action and get just sort of lay people involved. And one of the assumptions is that spontaneous action will happen because people are latently angry. And so sit-ins could activate anger as a conscious effort to get that latent anger externalized. This detour through the 1960s is meant to provide a kind of resonant precedent for the moment of the Rage Room. And I'll end with one final example for media and communication scholars. And that's the Bobo doll experiments at Stanford University. So I'm just going to finish by talking about why I think this is significant and why I've revisited the Bobo doll experiments conducted by Albert Bandura and his collaborators at Stanford. For those who don't know or don't remember, the Bobo doll experiments are a series of psychological experiments conducted at Stanford, published first in 1961 and continuing for a few years after. They were conducted at Stanford's Day Nursery School, which is a nursery school owned and operated by the psychology department at Stanford. The original nursery school that you see in these photographs is now the site of SRI, the research group. Though the nursery school still exists right in the heart of campus. It's about a 20-minute walk from the psychology department. It's called the Bing Nursery School. It was funded using an NSF grant for infrastructure funding, which is described as an ingenious way of not having to apply for experimental funding. When Bandura died in 2021, he was widely eulogized as one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. So for those who don't know, by one measure, he's the fourth most cited psychologist after Freud, Skinner, and Piaget. He would go on to be known for many things, mostly social learning theory, and the Bobo doll experiments kind of inaugurate his attempts to prove social learning as an exception to the Skinnerian behaviorist view. Sorry if none of that makes sense. I'm going to get into it in a second. The studies, crucially, purported to show that children exposed to the demonstration of violence, whether live or recorded, were more likely to mimic that violence, whether or not they were encouraged to do so. They are the basis of what would become social learning theory. In the main treatment group, children aged 3 to 5 are brought into a classroom by a reasonable adult. The room has 2 sets of different toys in 2 different areas, 2 corners. A set of paints for a child and a different set of toys, including Tinker Toys, a mallet, a pegboard, and a Bobo doll with a stranger adult sitting beside it. The responsible adult leaves the room. The kid plays with the toys. After a few minutes, the stranger adult stands up, mounts the Bobo doll, and beats it in the face with the mallet before picking it up and kicking it across the room. While she does this, she is saying to herself out loud, sock him in the nose, hit him down, throw him in the air, kick him, pow. He keeps coming back for more. And my favorite one, he sure is a tough fella. She repeats this 3 times in identical fashion. And by the end, she's sweaty as I am. And at that moment, the responsible adult comes back in the room, says to the child, "We're going to move to another room now." And the other angry adult sits, sweaty in the corner, and they move to a middle room that's going to connect a third room in a few minutes. This second room is full of the nicest toys you have ever seen. Everything I'm saying is taken from the Bobo doll experiment text. A fire engine, a locomotive, a jet fighter plane, a cable car, a colorful spinning top, and a doll set. The doll set comes with its own wardrobe, its own baby carriage, and its own miniature baby crib. The responsible adult says, "These toys are for you to play with." That's what's happening right here. And the child gets stuck in. After about 2 minutes, or whenever the child is fully involved with the toys, the responsible adult stands up and says, "I'm sorry, these toys are for the other children," and tells the child to leave the room and enter a third room. The child, suitably incensed, follows the responsible adult to the next room. In the third room, the child confronts the same set of toys that the angry adult used in the first room. The responsible adult leaves the child with the toys and heads to work at a desk in the corner and ignores them. The child plays with the truck for a minute, but soon turns towards the clown doll. She clumsily pushes it over and tries to climb on top of it. She says, "Sock him," and she punches the doll in the face. She says, "Throw him in the air." She also says, "Horses biting," but that's just improvisation. After 20 minutes, the responsible adult rises from her desk, approaches the child, and tells her it is time to leave. She says nothing about the child's behavior. The experiment's repeated across 72 preschoolers and repeated using a recorded film and a cartoon. All of the child's actions are monitored by research assistants behind a two-way mirror who are marking or following the markers of imitation, right? That's why the script is there. That's why the actions are repeated 3 times, so they can signify actual imitation. This is some of my material. It's hard to see from Albert Bandura's archive at Stanford, including an actual Bobo doll, though I think this one wasn't actually used because it's not marked up at all. You can't really see in the right-hand image, but that's those are actually the findings from the second Bobo doll experiment marking aggression, which is code for anger in the second Bobo doll experiments. That's the research assistant's findings. They were repeated, as I said. They were also meant to be evidence against the case for catharsis that Bandura himself calls out. And in one summary of these studies in an obituary for Bandura, they say they challenge the prevailing Freudian assumption about the role of unconscious impulses, identification, and catharsis in explaining behavior. It's also, I should say, Stanford is a really weird place. It becomes probably the world's most prominent psychology department. This happens just a few years before Phil Zimbardo does the prison experiment in the department's basement. It's the same nursery school where Walter Mischel does the marshmallow experiment, where children, and I try to figure out if it could be some of the same kids. It's not. Wouldn't that be amazing? But it's a weird place. It's a weird place. But it's also a supremely important place in the history of psychology and the 20th century. Like I said, I'm not an illustrator. In every interpretation I have read of the Bobo doll experiments, whether positive or negative, right? And I have my opinions on media effects research. I'm not getting into the truth claims here. But they're crucial to the history of how we understand mediated violence, social learning, the risks of media, right? The risks of violent media. Every single response to these studies focuses on the connection between room 1 and room 3, the imitation of what happened in room 1 happening in room 3. Reenactment is seen as dispositive of learning. I am fascinated by room 2, the space of internalized frustration, what the experiment calls aggression arousal. It's here in the connecting room that anger is intentionally generated for the purposes of research, where the preschool child is insulted and sabotaged, so they're full to capacity with anger in need, right? In need of a target in room 3. What unites these different rooms, some of the different rooms I've been working with today and across this project, including the Bobo doll experiments, the Destruction and Art Symposium, catharsis studies of Bushman and others, rage rooms. All of these deal with what I've called the media of purgation. losing control to gain control. What we find, though, is rival and incommensurable ways of thinking about anger and thinking about culture and media beyond. Rival and incommensurable ways of thinking that nonetheless continue to coexist and shape the contours of our debates about the appropriate use of anger and violence. So while they disagree about the utility of anger, they all cultivate anger as a resource for social, psychological, and artistic discovery. So today's moment of the Rage Room is a moment because it crystallizes a peculiar set of affective modes and cultural texts specific to our economic, political, and technological context. But it also draws on and remixes existing ways of talking about the power of rage and the need for catharsis. I think there's undeniably a widespread understanding that anger needs a vent and that the hydraulics of anger are threatening to erupt everywhere and anywhere. At the same time as there's a personal responsibility to extinguish that fervent or to channel it healthily. Today's Rage Room crystallizes in an almost absurd fashion other attempts to cultivate, channel, and contain rage. And I think to understand this contemporary moment, we have to understand these uses of rage and the political articulations of anger and politics and technology. And I thank you for your time.